Yes. Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those who are on the other side of the globe, or good night. But it's a great pleasure and really a privilege to introduce Arshia Sattar. She is an author, a translator, a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, a theater person, and has taught at many places and sometimes nowadays teaches at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad and the Srishti School in Bangalore. And her work has included translations of the Katha Saritasagar from the Sanskrit into English and in an abridged version, and the translation of the Ramayana also from Sanskrit into, that is Valmiki's Ramayana, an abridged version of that. Both these translations are wonderful to read, and I would strongly recommend all participants that you should try and get these works to read. Arshia is going to talk to us about the cities that the Ramayana describes, and that perhaps is a kind of imagination that we will find useful as both as a guide and a cautionary tale. And so we are very happy to have Arshia with us, and I invite her to start her talk.
Thank you, Nilkan. Thank you for locating me, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you all. I did very little background reading, but about this studio and this particular project, and I'm very honored to be in a list of such stellar speakers. But one of the things that the list of speakers indicated to me, which was very heartwarming, is how far and wide you are spreading your net, as it were, because I mean, now perhaps more than ever, it's more and more important for us to talk across disciplines, to realize that wherever this world is taking us, this 21st century, it has to be a century of solidarities. It has to be a century of conversations. It has to be a time and a place where we realize that whatever knowledge we have is just a tiny, tiny, tiny part of a much, much bigger whole, and that our knowledges must interact and our knowledges must inform each other. So in that context, I'm absolutely delighted that you thought that something from the past, from so profoundly the past, would be of interest and would speak to a general, well, to a very specific audience. I'm sorry, there's a rooster that lives outside my window. I don't know if you can hear him, but he, you know, he's just the cock of the walk, as it were. So he crows when he wants to. So I hope it won't be too disturbing. So I'm going to read a paper which is based in one of the books I wrote. The book is called Lost Loves, and it examines Rama's narrative trajectory through the Ramayana, and it thinks of the Ramayana as a love story, a very tragic love story. But in the book, there's a chapter called Three Cities, Three Dharmas. And this paper is based on that. So I'm going to read it because there's a lot of stuff that I have to quote and not like that. So if I read too quickly or you're unable to hear me, just let me know. So here we go. When Neelakantha first approached me to do this talk, we felt that in the context of the proposed redevelopment of Delhi's central vista, a conversation about cities in the Ramayana would be appropriate. But I realize now that there is another appropriation of space that we need to keep in mind as a larger context for this discussion. And that is the construction of the Ram Mandir, effectively by the BJP, on a formerly disputed site in Ayodhya. Together, these appropriations will ensure that the visual imagery of the nation becomes increasingly and exclusively Hindu. The Ram Mandir reminds Muslims of the status of their religion in the country of which they are citizens, and the new central vista imposes a new vision of the nation upon an older one. The current dispensation is not unique or revolutionary in its desire to leave an indelible stamp on a political and historical landscape. Nor are they so in their desire to transform symbolic locations of power in their own image. Mussolini did it during the war with his EUR just outside Rome. Hitler used Albert Speer to concretize his vision of a powerful, racially pure nation. Qutbuddin Aibak erected the Qutb Minar, a victory tower that could be seen for miles, to announce his conquest of the Delhi plain. The British moved the capital of their empire to the same place, at Delhi, ceding to themselves all the emotional resonance of occupying the subcontinent's traditional seat of imperial power. Even the Pandavas reoccupied Hastinapura, the city of their ancestors, after they defeated their cousins in the Mahabharata war. And this, despite the fact that they had Indraprastha for themselves, a city that had been built on the funeral pyre of the Khandava forest. One way to think about the character of a city is to say that it is made by the people who live there. But another way to think about a city is to say that a city's texture and color and nature is created by its power elites, and the people who live there slowly begin to embody the attributes and qualities that are bestowed upon them, as it were. Citizens begin to behave in ways that conform to what their habitat wants. A habitat that has been artificially created with definite social and political agenda in mind. Valmiki describes such cities in his Ramayana, cities where the character of the place and its people are congruent. Although we now inhabit a world in which Ayodhya and Lanka have actual geographical locations, the cities of those names that appear in the Ramayana are mythical. I trust that their descriptions will persuade you that they are mythical. Lanka is no longer covered in jewels, if it ever was, and the Ayodhya we know is hardly a place of broad, clean streets and gleaming white towers. Of course, Valmiki's cities serve the demands of his story, but a great text like the Ramayana leaps across its narrative boundaries and suggests ways in which we might re-examine the constructs of our contemporary lives. So even though Ramayana in the Indian imagination is a text that we associate primarily with exile, Valmiki spends many of his extraordinary talents on describing the three cities of the Ramayana. As we all know, Rama spent 14 years in exile, banished from Ayodhya by his whimsical stepmother who wished her own son to be king. The promise Rama made to Kaikeyi was not simply that he would live in the forest for 14 years, that he would live in the forest as an ascetic for 14 years, but that he would not enter any city for that period. At first, he settles in Nandigrama, then he moves deeper and deeper into the Dandaka forest with his wife Sita and his brother Lakshmana, well past the settlements of the sages in Panchavati and Janasthana. In Dandaka, his wife is stolen away from him, and even after he makes an alliance with the monkey Sugriva, Rama remains outside the city of Kishkindha, preferring to live in the caves that dot the hillsides around Pampa Sarovara. In the final months of his exile, Rama lays siege to Lanka, the Rakshasa's magnificent city, until the final battle when Ravana is killed. And then, after 14 long years filled with trials and tribulations, Rama returns in triumph to Ayodhya, taking back the kingship and the kingdom that were always rightfully his. There are three cities in the Ramayana: Ayodhya, Kishkindha, and Lanka. each belonging to a different kind of being, the human, the monkey, and the Rakshasa. And each one having its own dharma, a code of behavior that it imposes on its citizens. Given that there are three kinds of beings in the Ramayana, the humans, the monkeys, and the Rakshasas, there are also three ways to be. Further, there are effectively three worlds in the Ramayana, each located in and defined by a city. Each of the cities, Ayodhya, Kishkindha, and Lanka, reflects the nature of the beings that live in it. Each of them embodies the characteristics of its peoples. By depicting each of the cities as having a unique milieu, the Ramayana also explores multiple dharmas, or ways of being in the world. Kishkindha, the city of the monkeys, and Lanka, the city of the Rakshasas, are set in contrast to Ayodhya, just as monkey and Rakshasa dharmas are contrasted with human codes of behavior and ethics lived out by Rama and his brothers. There is also a fourth world in the story, the liminal world of the forest, where different creatures and different ways of being collide, where the way one lives and which dharma one follows appears to be a matter of choice. In the cities, however, ways of being and doing are determined and unalterable. I will extend the city and dharma argument a little further and suggest that the dharma a city sanctions is visited most especially upon its women, that women are expected to embody the dharma of their city. As such, the violations of the city's dharma involve transgressions perpetrated on women. The descriptions of Ayodhya, the city inhabited by humans, are relatively minimal, the city being defined more by reference to the nature of its people and the order that prevails in it rather than by its buildings. The most important thing about Ayodhya is the maintenance of order, which includes, of course, the four castes behaving as they should. The maintenance of order that is consequent upon the righteousness of its rulers and the upholding of dharma. So I'm going to read from my translation of Valmiki. This is from the Balakanda. Always associated with truth, King Dasharatha supported the three upper castes and ruled his city the way Indra ruled Amaravati. The people who lived in Dasharatha's city were happy, learned, and virtuous. There was no need for greed, for each was satisfied with what he had and spoke the truth. No one was poor in Ayodhya. People lived happily with their cows, horses, and families, and with what wealth they had. Nowhere in Ayodhya would you see a man who was lustful, cruel, or miserly, no one who was illiterate or an atheist. Men and women were righteous, disciplined, and happy. They resembled the great sages in their conduct and behavior. Everyone adorned themselves with earrings, coronets, and necklaces. They bathed every day and anointed themselves with sweet-smelling unguents. No one ate impure food, nor did they let their neighbors go hungry. Just as no one was unadorned, so too there was no one with a distracted mind. Even though Ayodhya had thousands of Brahmins, people did not neglect the performance of household sacrifices and rituals. Brahmins were committed to the performance of public rituals and were allowed to accept gifts. They were learned and had conquered their senses because of their exalted characters. There were no unbelievers, nor were there any ignorant or unrighteous people in Ayodhya. There were no libertines either. There was no sadness, no poverty. Men and women were beautiful and wealthy, and they were all devoted to their king. A guest was honored as a god in the homes of all four castes. People took refuge in the truth and lived well into old age. The Kshatriyas placed the Brahmins first, and the Vaishyas followed the Kshatriyas, and the Shudras, according to their duty, served the other three castes. So that's the end of the quote. So what we see of the city is sort of by the way, right? When the citizens of Ayodhya hear about Rama's coronation, they are delighted. And, I quote, the joyous citizens began to decorate the city. Banners and bunting danced in the breeze from the temple spires that gleamed like white clouds, from the homes and terraces of rich and prominent citizens, from roads and city squares, from private homes and public buildings. Even the tallest trees were decorated with brightly colored flags. Flowers were scattered in the streets, sweet incense filled the air, and wooden torches as large as trees lined the street. At other moments, we follow Rama from palace to palace as he hears about and then conveys the news of his banishment. And now we see the city as a backdrop. Rama looked upon his prosperous city, its squares and highways crowded with horses and elephants and chariots, and its people who displayed their abundant wealth, lined with shops displaying goods for sale. And he, Rama, felt proud and happy. So while there is wealth and prosperity in Ayodhya, there is an atmosphere of restraint and virtue, of whiteness and purity, of gleaming spires and orderly streets and squares. The only moment of chaos we experience in Ayodhya is when Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana depart for the forest. As Rama drove out of Ayodhya for his long stay in the forest, the city was filled with the sounds of horses' trappings jingling, of elephants trumpeting, of agitated people. The sounds swelled and reverberated as the entire city, old and young, ran behind Rama's chariot as they would run towards water in the parched months of the summer. End quote. As an example of the character of the city and the behavior of its people in Ayodhya, the issue of disputed kingship between Rama and Bharata is resolved with grace and delicacy. Rama does not contest his father's decree that he be banished into the forest for 14 years. His brother Bharata, who inherits the throne as a corollary to Rama's exile, is ashamed of his mother's machinations and tries to persuade Rama to take back the kingship which is rightfully his. He comes to meet Rama in Nandigrama, where Rama has decided to live, and Bharata says, "What will I do with this advice on the duties of a king when I have renounced kingship? The eternally established dharma states that while an older son lives, a younger son cannot be king. Come back with me to prosperous Ayodhya, Rama, and crown yourself king for the glory of our clan." But Rama refuses the throne and promises to reclaim his inheritance after he has lived out his 14 years in the forest. The monkeys seem to live a more emotionally charged life in their city of Kishkindha than do the citizens of Ayodhya. As Sugriva, the exiled monkey king, tells Rama, the story of his plight, he refers to not only his brother Vali's power and strength, but also to his love of sensuality and drink, of how Vali has claimed Sugriva's wife even as he reclaimed the kingdom. After Vali's death, Rama cannot enter the city of Kishkindha because of the terms of his exile. But Lakshmana enters Kishkindha after the reigns have ended to remind Sugriva, who has succumbed to the same love of luxury and pleasure as his brother. Okay, I'm going to read now Valmiki's description of Kishkindha, which is actually one of my favorite passages in Ramayana. Lakshmana looked around the city nestling in the valley with its jewel-studded buildings and flower-filled gardens. Full of elegant mansions and shops, Kishkindha overflowed with trees that flowered and fruited all through the year. The monkey citizens were all children of the gods and Gandharvas, and they could change their forms at will. They were beautiful to behold in their fine clothes and celestial garlands. Kishkindha's roads were perfumed with flowers and sandal paste, and the fragrance of natural liquors like mead and toddy wafted through the air. Lakshmana saw the homes of the great monkey chiefs and the wide thoroughfares that gleamed like white clouds. They were decorated with celestial flowers, filled with wealth and grain, and adorned by women who shone like jewels. The king's palace rivaled Indra's. It was surrounded by sparkling white walls that were hard to breach. It had several white towers that were like the peaks of Mount Kailasha. Its garden had trees gifted by Indra that gave any kind of fruit you could wish for. They were covered with flowers and provided generous, soothing shade. Mighty Lakshmana entered Sugriva's palace uninvited, as the sun enters a huge cloud. He passed through 7 courtyards before he came to the heavily guarded inner apartments that were filled with couches of gold and silver and seats that were covered with rich and beautiful brocades. Lakshmana could hear soft and melodious music when he walked in, and he saw scores of women, all of them reveling in their youth and beauty. They sat there, adorned with rare flowers and exquisite jewels, weaving garlands. Lakshmana could not see a single retainer who was lazy, discontented, or not fully adorned. So different from Ayodhya, yeah? I mean, which is the more attractive city? Well, at least for some of us. For all that Ayodhya is a city of restraint, Kishkindha seems to be a city of pleasure. The monkeys are honorable, but they're also good-looking hedonists who love silks and brocades and jewels and fine liquors. There is a lushness that hangs over Kishkindha and defines the actions of its citizens. The dharma of the monkeys permits the transfer of wives between brothers, and monkey women appear to have freedoms that human women do not. While Tara and Ruma are Sugriva's wives, Tara is also a wise counselor who advises her first husband Vali and then does the same for Sugriva when he takes her as a wife after Vali's death. Tara is also the one who explains to Lakshmana that Sugriva had not forgotten his promise to Rama, that he had merely lost himself in the pleasures that had been denied to him for all his years in exile. It is as if she is making a case for Sugriva to recover himself as a pleasure-loving monkey before he can be of any real use to Rama. The situation in Kishkindha presents us with an inverted mirror of what happened in Ayodhya. Here, there are 2 brothers, one of whom is in exile, and there is only one throne. The Kishkindha dispute is resolved more aggressively when the younger brother, Sugriva, has his older brother, Vali, killed. The grace of Ayodhya has been replaced with violence, with a more visceral solution that is in keeping with the more heightened emotions that motivate the citizens of Kishkindha, whether it is Vali and his anger or Sugriva and his fear. Even Rama has one of his few explosions of rage in the Kishkindha region when he believes that Sugriva has forgotten the terms of their alliance. But the Ramayana reserves its best for last with regard to the cities it describes. It is never more lyrical, never more astonishing in its visual imagery than when it describes Lanka. Of course, it's also true that it's easier to describe a place that has many layers of pleasure than it is to describe a place that is just kind of real virtuous, but also really dull. Even Hanuman, citizen of Kishkindha, where liquor flows and there are silks and jewels everywhere, is astounded by what he sees in Ravana's city. He's so seduced by Lanka's beauty that he almost forgets why he is there. And I quote, Hanuman gazed in wonder at the city of Lanka, which seemed like the city of the gods. It had beautiful gateways and ramparts with climbing vines carved on them that surrounded hundreds of mansions festooned with flags and banners. Situated on top of a mountain, the city with its dazzling white buildings looked like it was hanging in the air. Hanuman reached the northern gates and saw the city spread before him like a woman, the walls and ramparts her body, the vast ocean her clothes, the fortifications her hair, and the upper stories of the mansions her earrings. Lanka was as fine and lofty as the peaks of Kailasha and seemed to touch the sky. When what Hanuman sees when he enters the city is even more wondrous. His experience of Lanka is at night, not in darkness, but bathed in a seductive and sympathetic moonlight. We don't often notice, but Hanuman's adventures in Lanka are actually only one night long, and it's a full moon night. And this is what the text says. When night fell, Hanuman rose and entered the magnificent city, which was divided into quarters by huge, wide roads. Its multi-storied mansions had floors of crystal set in gold, and the mansions themselves were studded with pearls and gems. Hanuman entered the city filled with lofty mansions that were like autumn clouds. He climbed onto Lanka's ramparts, which were made of precious metals, and stared in astonishment at golden gates adorned with lapis and pearls and diamonds and decorated with beaten gold and silver. But of course, there's still more to go, no? Because this is just a city, and Hanuman enters Ravana's palace, where there were thousands of golden vehicles and heavily carved palanquins that shone like the sun. There were vine-covered arbors, opulent rooms, picture galleries, recreation areas with hills fashioned out of wood, pleasant sitting rooms and lavish bedrooms. The palace shone like the sun because of its jewels and because of Ravana's own splendor. Flowing with honey and with all kinds of liquor in jeweled vessels, it was like the palace of the god of wealth. Okay, end quote. The opulence and excess of Lanka are mentioned over and over again, each image of sensuality and decadence outdoing the one before. And once again, as with Kishkindha, the essence of the city is located in the descriptions of its women. And this truly, truly is my favorite passage in Ramayana. Hanuman saw exquisite women who appeared to be high-minded, virtuous, and pure. They shone like stars, absorbed in their lovers and their drinking. He saw other women who were illuminated by their own beauty, but they were shy and hid in their lovers' arms like birds clinging to their mates, enjoying a night of bliss. He saw women with smooth complexions, bare-breasted, with skin the color of molten gold, others with skin like moonlight. Everywhere he looked, Hanuman saw rows upon rows of moon-bright faces, eyes with long curling lashes, and ornaments that glittered like lightning. And then he looks at Ravana's women. He goes into Ravana's apartment. There were women from the royal families of sages, Daityas and Gandharvas and Rakshasas, and they had all come to Ravana out of love. No one had been carried away against her will. They had all been won over by Ravana's personality. None of them had loved another or been the wife of another, none except Sita, the daughter of Janaka. Each of Ravana's wives was nobly born, beautiful, skilled in the arts of pleasure, and extremely desirable. And the monkey, who only had worthy thoughts, said to himself, how lucky Rama would be if his wife was like the wives of the Rakshasa king. Then he grew agitated and reminded himself that Sita was far better than these other women and that the king of Lanka had done a terrible and ignoble thing. End quote. Surely Lanka is Ayodhya turned around. Fortified strength has become decoration, has become proud decoration. Prosperity and wealth have become sensual beauty and showy ostentation. Virtue has turned to passion, chastity and restraint to promiscuity and indulgence. These same qualities are displayed in the way Lanka's kingship is sorted out. Once again, Rama is the instrument by which a younger brother acquires a throne. Vibhishana, the younger brother of Ravana, believes that Ravana is an unrighteous ruler And so he leaves his brother and plots with Rama about how best to conquer Lanka and overcome the might of the Rakshasas. Vibhishana's actions are duplicitous, reflecting the secrecy and shadows of the night. Ravana's enormous arrogance will not allow him to return Sita, nor will it let him admit to any mistakes that he might have made. Vibhishana does not fit in this atmosphere charged with excess and immoderation, a spectacular and uncaring decadence that can only be hurtling towards its own doom. Hanuman's first vision of Lanka is as a woman. It is noteworthy that there are no physical descriptions of Ayodhya's women similar to those for the women of Kishkindha and Lanka. While we have some sense of what individual women in Ayodhya, Sita, Kaikeyi, Manthara, Kaushala, are like, there are no descriptions of Ayodhya's women as a group. We are told that Manthara is a hunchback, but the royal women are never described in terms of their physical attributes. The way women are portrayed is contiguous with the city and the culture or dharma that each of the cities supports. The conservative nature of human relations in Ayodhya is amplified by the fact that the city's women are not described in terms of their bodies or in relation to men. Ayodhya's women are chaste and submissive and stay well within their conjugal boundaries, which makes Manthara's conniving and Kaikeyi's petulant greed all the more remarkable. In Kishkindha, where monkey dharma allows shared sexual partners, women are described in some detail. But finally, in Lanka, where Rakshasa dharma allows multiple partners, the women are lavishly and lovingly described in all their glory, in all their sensual glory. Just as human, monkey, and Rakshasa women have different boundaries in terms of who they can sleep with, so too, cities define the possible relations between themselves and offer different solutions to the problem of disputed kingship. It is as if the city is the boundary within which societies can flourish in their unique coherence and with a single dharma in operation, whether it is human society in Ayodhya, monkey society in Kishkindha, or Rakshasa society in Lanka. It is through these descriptions of the cities and the women that inhabit them that we see how clearly dharma, its maintenance as well as its violation, centers around women, how dharma hovers on the edge of conjugal behavior and marital transgressions. While cities can only accommodate one dharma at a time, the forest becomes a space where multiple dharmas can and do exist simultaneously for women as well. We know that the sages' wives inhabit the forest with their firm adherence to the rules and regulations of marriage and hermitage living. But the forest is also the habitat of Shurpanakha, sister to Ravana, single and promiscuous. When Shurpanakha approaches Rama and Lakshmana in the Dandaka forest, she says, "I am the Rakshasi Shurpanakha, and I can change my form at will. I do as I please. I wander through this forest by myself and strike terror into the hearts of all creatures." She describes her Rakshasa brothers and ends her introduction with a boast about her freedom as a single woman, saying that none of my brothers have any control over me. As a Rakshasi, Shurpanakha has the right to proposition men that she finds attractive, which she does when she sees Rama and Lakshmana. To the princes, however, this free woman embodies the qualities of the forest itself: wild, unknown, untamable, and eventually threatening. The rules of Ayodhya, the only rules that the princes know, make the single and sexually active woman dangerous. In a terrible miscalculation with far-reaching and devastating consequences, they mutilate the Rakshasi, applying the principles of Ayodhya dharma in a place where it is inappropriate. In direct contrast to Shurpanakha and all that her presence in the forest implies, there is also the mysterious Swayamprabha, the self-illuminated ascetic who lives in an enchanted cave into which the monkeys stumble as they search for Sita. With the power accumulated through the practice of her austerities, Swayamprabha saves the monkeys and transports them directly to the shores of the ocean. The forest, therefore, supports the sexual aggression and indulgence of Shurpanakha, as well as the fierce celibacy of Swayamprabha. Thus, the forest, or rather any space outside the city, is an indeterminate space where multiple dharmas can coexist. It is established as a space of fluidity, where shapes can change and where unusual and challenging choices become available. Many scholars have pointed to the fact that in literatures across the world, spaces outside the city are seen as liminal zones, spaces where transgressions can occur without retribution. The rules of the city do not apply. Characters come up against the unexpected, the magical, the dangerous. I would like to extend this and suggest that when transgressive behaviors or acts, which might have been allowed in the forests and in the wilderness, when such transgressive behaviors are committed within the city, they lead to disaster. A determined way of life is threatened and quite often shaken. Transgressive behaviors have to be contained or uprooted for order to be maintained. In the case of the Ramayana, these transgressions within the city are catastrophic. The severity of the violation is determined by the nature of the dharma in each particular city, but each of the violations involves a woman. Dasharatha's surrender to Kaikeyi's demands goes against the dharma established in Ayodhya, where, apart from the established tradition of primogeniture, the norms of behavior are about restraint and the public good. Vali's addition of Ruma to his harem within the walls of Kishkindha while Sugriva is still alive violates the dharma of Kishkindha, which is otherwise rather more permissive with regard to multiple women and wives. Ravana brings Sita to Lanka by force, whereas all the other hundreds of women in his palace have come to him out of their own choice. Any of these actions, from Dasharatha to Vali or Ravana, might have been permissible in the space outside the city, but because they occur within their own cities, they become transgressive and lead to catastrophe. For Rama and Sita, it is the return to Ayodhya and its stringent dharma with regard to women that leads to the tragedy that lies at the heart of the Ramayana, Rama and Sita's final separation. Once he is back in Ayodhya, with its restrictive moralities and codes of conduct, Rama assumes the role of a king and banishes his pregnant wife into the forest because his people question her chastity. It is as if the Agni Pariksha that proved Sita's innocence on the battlefield in front of the monkeys and the Rakshasas was not sufficient proof for Ayodhya. In the places where dharmas other than human dharma upheld by Ayodhya prevailed, Sita could be considered chaste after the Agni Pariksha. But Ayodhya cannot accept this proof of the trial by fire, even though it was a trial blessed by the gods. It appears that Ayodhya cannot even countenance the possibility that an abducted woman might have remained unmolested. Rama sacrifices his personal happiness for the sake of Ayodhya's dharma, sending his beloved wife away from the city that will not take her back into its fold. When Sita does return, summoned by Valmiki to Rama's great sacrifice where the story of his life is being recited, Rama has already been reunited with his sons. Asked to prove her chastity once more in the presence of Ayodhya's citizens, this time it is Sita who goes away, rejecting both her husband and the city that has bound him within its moral strictures. Sita leaves Rama, Ayodhya, and her sons behind as she disappears into the earth, never to return. Her presence in Ayodhya has become irrelevant. For with Rama's sons having been publicly pronounced legitimate by Valmiki at the sacrifice, Ayodhya's future is secure. The mores of the same city, Ayodhya, demand that Rama kill the Shudraka Shambhuka, whose practicing austerities meant only for upper castes. If Ayodhya is to remain perfect, its castes must remain within their boundaries. We must take note of the fact that the turbulence caused by Shambhuka's illicit tapasya results in the death of a Brahmin's son. As described earlier, Ayodhya's prosperity is predicated on caste order, hierarchy, and the upholding of caste dharma as much as it is predicated on the righteousness of its king. It becomes Rama's duty as a good king to kill the Shudra who is acting above his station. But I'd like to return for a minute to the idea of the forest, the liminal space that is the locus of many dharmas, a place where one can decide how to behave, and in that sense can decide who to be. Rama and Lakshmana both carry this ambiguity of who they are upon their bodies. As many forest dwellers, including Shurpanakha, remark, the brothers have the matted hair of ascetics, but they carry the weapons of warriors. With these mixed signals, they confuse the creatures that they meet, but they also embody the idea of liminality, the potential for being both this and that at the same time, or choosing to be this at one time and that at another time. There is a very wonderful and unexpected moment in the Aranyakanda when Sita talks to Rama about violence. And she says, "Now that you are here with your brother and both of you are armed, you shall see many forest creatures. Inevitably, you will be tempted to use your arrows. Like dry fuel bursts into flames when it is near a fire, so too a Kshatriya's passions are ignited when he has a bow at hand. A Kshatriya should use his bow in the forest only to protect the oppressed. What a difference there is between the life of weapons and that of the forest, between the vows of a Kshatriya and those of an ascetic. We must learn to respect the code of behavior of the world we now inhabit. Here, the mind is perverted by extreme proximity to weapons. You can return to the code of the Kshatriyas, Rama, when we go back to Ayodhya. Rama and Lakshmana have chosen to continue living in the forest as warriors, despite the fact that on two previous occasions after the news of his banishment, once in Ayodhya and once in Nandigrama, Rama has himself rejected the dharma of a Kshatriya. Perhaps that was in preparation for his time away from the city. But if it was, it is clear that Rama has either forgotten to modify his actions or decided that it is not as important as he had once thought it might be. Sita's gentle nudge about behavior appropriate to the space in which one finds oneself and the violence that necessarily accompanies weapons, however, goes unheeded. Rama judges Shurpanakha's flirtation by a code that is his and not hers. And the consequences of that error of judgment are dire. It is in the spaces outside of Ayodhya where human dharma does not apply that Rama acts in ways that continue to trouble us. He encourages his brother to attack Shurpanakha. He kills Vali. It would appear that Rama has disregarded Sita's caution about adopting the Kshatriya code when he is outside Ayodhya, the place where his behavior as well as his destiny are fully determined. Ironically, it is the dharma of a Kshatriya that Rama violates when he kills Vali. He shoots the monkey from a hiding place. He shoots him from behind. He shoots him while he is engaged in combat with another. What makes many of us most uncomfortable is what Rama does when he returns to Ayodhya. He banishes Sita because his people, the citizens, are gossiping about her, and he kills Shambhuka. In both cases, however, he is upholding the dharma of his city and not transgressing it. In the city, it is Raja Dharma that determines Rama's actions rather than any personal desires or ideas of justice. I'm going to conclude by coming back to our problem of the central vista. So one of the things that this paper suggests is that cities create their own dharmas that demand allegiance from the people who live there. That is, cities can also tell us that there are appropriate ways to behave that go beyond the civic, that revolve around personal morality and public practice. This takes me back to where we started this morning about how cities can be remade to encourage certain kinds of thoughts and actions, that a right and good way to live in a particular city can be dictated by the construction and restriction, excuse me, of its public spaces. For me, the most obvious example of this is when we think about how women are invited to occupy cities. Are there enough streetlights? Are the streets lined with high walls and impenetrable fences? Who is on the streets at night? And so on. A city dictating a life rather than a lifestyle extends beyond the question of women in public when we consider where certain kinds of people are allowed to live, who is ghettoized versus who has a free run of the entire city for work and play, who voluntarily builds gated communities, and which people are thrust into the margins. The capital's central vista was designed in its own time with its own particular message, and that message perhaps was one of imperial majesty. It was inherited by a young nation that sought to counter its implications of distance and subjugation in various ways, including by creating a constitution that militated against the hierarchy and divisions implied by the public architecture that housed the seat of government. I watched Bimal Desai's presentation of the redesign of Central Vista at CEPT as a preparation for this talk. And I know that he's a colleague of many of yours, so I will make sure that my comments are entirely respectful. But I do find it remarkable that he speaks of sacred geometries and he references the Sri Yantra. He speaks of Parliament House as a sacred building and a temple of democracy, as he shows us a picture of our current Prime Minister kissing the floor of Parliament when it was sworn in to office. The spoken and visual vocabulary of his presentation, despite its offhand references to the Dalis of Humayun's tomb and the gilded roof of the Golden Temple, can leave us in no doubt as to where secular representation or the inclusion of any minority in the nation's embrace lies in this new design. Perhaps inadvertently, though, Desai is showing us exactly how the nation's diversity will be acknowledged in the new Central Vista. We shall be relegated to design elements, a pretty window here, as Desai himself says, and a gilded spire there. The redevelopment of the Central Vista has been described, and Srivatsan says this in his introduction to Desai's talk, as one of the most significant urban design projects in post-independence India. Of course it is that. The new Central Vista in the nation's capital will send out a strong message intended for more than the city in which it stands. It will tell us that there is a single dharma. There is one appropriate way to be Indian, no matter who we are and where in the country we live. This is not merely a significant urban design project. It is a project that seeks to redesign the minds and hearts of Indian citizens. Thank you.
What a wonderful talk. You've got our minds whizzing into all kinds of territories. Thank you very much for this talk. It really does something to our studio thoughts. I think we can have some questions, perhaps. Yeah? Yeah.
Perhaps I can pick up one question. just sort of entering this edgewise. I mean, two things stand out for me. One is, of course, not just the sort of location of women in the cities as embodiments of systems of order and patriarchy, so to speak, but the use of the body of the woman to describe the city, which is distinct from all modernist contentions of the city, which generally locate themselves around either an abstracted ideal body or male body, or even it is taught often in Indian, I was taught in my education in India around the figure of the Vastu Purush, which is also either a castrated body or a male body. So in that sense, it's fantastic to hear the description in particular of Lanka as and I'm not referring to the women in the city, but you're the first description that you had from the quotation of the city as a woman's body. And that would be very fascinating to unpack and theorize from there, simply in terms of architectural thinking and urban thinking of what that might imply for thinking about just a theoretical city, let's just say, if one wanted to create, beginning with that premise. If we wanted to recreate Lanka today in a sort of a modernist idiom, would be a fascinating place to start, which would certainly not address any of the other sort of gender bias critiques that you put, but it just struck me as something very fascinating to begin with. So that's just my one observation. But the other thing that occurs to me is you produce the forest as a space of liminality, which therefore is other to the city as the idea of bordered space. And that seems to be a trans-cultural idea. I mean, it seems very familiar to the idea of city in the Roman description or in the Greek descriptions. And striking to me, of course, Valmiki is writing when? 11th century, 10th? When is he writing?
500 BCE. Well, maybe 300 BCE. Yeah.
300 BCE? Arey, wow, that's cool.
Yeah. Millennia.
So 300. So he's in that sense part very much of the, I suppose, the Indo-European.
Absolutely.
So it's striking for me how absolutely continuous that description is. And then therefore the idea of the forest as the idea of liminality, which is, produced, for instance, as the idea of Cora in certain French feminist readings of Socrates and Plato and so on and so forth. So absolutely. I think that's interesting. So given both these things, then, I mean, it's strange to, although I completely agree with you, but that comes from a person trained in modernism, to bring in the idea of secularism as the benchmark to evaluate central vista. If the cities traditionally are constructed as spaces of ideation of a particular social order, then one would say, just polemically, I don't agree with this, but polemically one would say the Central Vista project is in sync with the regimented construction of the city, rather than this very modern construction. We have the city as a place of freedom and liberty. If you read Lefebvre, I mean, by all your descriptions, a city is not a place of citizen freedom. Rather, city is a place of prescription.
Yep. Absolutely. No, I do think the Central Vista is not simply harkening back, but actually bringing forward and embodying restrictions, hierarchies, patriarchy, all the things that certainly we imagined we were on the way to conquering. But this is a real recidivist vision. And it is a vision of the nation. I mean, let us not have any doubt about that. This is what we look at. This is who we want to be. This is who we are going to force to become. Yeah, and
So But just to conclude, sorry, and is the city, therefore, by your reading, by definition, is a place, by historical definition, is a place of oppression that has to be overcome through the march of progress?
No, I mean, I'd love to live in Lanka personally, I mean, it sounds like a really good place for women. I'm not sure that there is a march of progress that will sort of, not teleological. It'll be, as we build more and more cities, they will get better and better. But I do think that we, rather than imagining that we build cities, I want us to think about how cities build us. What happens to our minds, what happens to our bodies, depending on the kind of city in which we live. And more, as we consciously construct cities and monuments, there is an ideology that is not simply being displayed, but is actually being imposed upon men, men of course, but women much, much more than on men. And that has always been the case, that, like nations' histories are written upon women's bodies. The borders of a city are defined by what happens to women within them and without them. Yeah.
You sign me on to design Lanka. I'm in.
Make sure that you have a consultant, I mean, it'll go much better. So.
But it might also be that we need to go back to the forest rather than build a new city, whether Lanka or Kishkindha or Ayodhya all seem to have some kind of codes of conduct which will drive in a certain direction. But the forest is the place of finding out.
Yes. The forest sorry, please.
How would a society make a forest be available? That might be a very good question. Is it in childhood? Is it in adolescence? Is it all through your life, etc.?
Well, I mean, in those ways, I feel that, Kishkindha, the way Kishkindha is described, the description that I shared with you, it seems to be the most fluid in terms of its relationship with its natural environment, because it's full of fruiting and flowering trees. And, I mean, there's so many descriptions of flowers in that, 10, 29 paragraph. And of course, the monkeys are forest dwellers. And so, I mean, certainly even in our lifetimes, the way we grew up as children in cities and how close the non-city was, and the cities that we live in now. I mean, I live in Bangalore, and you have to go miles to get away from the highway even. And in the Hindu paradigm, for a man's life, let us always remember that, Purushartha, is for men, not for people like myself. But in the 4 stages of life and all that, the time when a person lives in the forest is when they're young. Typically a Gurukula is in a forest, or an ashram is in a forest. And again in our Vanaprastha stage, right? When we have finished with all our familial obligations, when Muslims are supposed to go to Hajj, Hindus are supposed to go to the forest, but it means that you have completed your obligations as a social being, and then you can go live in the forest. So I think it's interesting that it's in the early part of your life, so you learn what the forest is, and it's in the latter part of your life when you need to think about things other than where is the dowry coming for my daughter. So that's the idealized Brahminical paradigm for Hindu society, and it is upper caste and it is male.
If I can ask a question, are we creating a problem for ourselves when we construct the ideal of the secular city? Because its Eurocentric roots over there, religion is a much more disciplined affair. So separation into a private realm is far easier. But I've been trying to look at it from readings of Gandhi. I've been trying that recently. And as I understand him, he was against that definition of secularism because that would mean excising the sacred from life. His notion of Swaraj is very much based on the recognition of the sacred autonomy of the self. Yeah. And by putting the stress on ahimsa, he's calling for a compulsion to recognize. Whereas secularism with its notions of categorization can shift definitions to the spectacle of the city versus recognition within the city.
I think that those of us who claim to be liberal or left or, who claim to be secular, I think one of the great failures of the last 70 years is that we haven't spent enough time defining secularism for ourselves. And I think that if we did that, we don't have to borrow Western notions. We don't also have to take on Gandhi, in an unreconstructed, unquestioning way. And I think that now, perhaps now, as Neelakant was saying before everybody else joined us, that maybe this is the dawn of a new age. And maybe that age should be predicated on what our indigenous thought out ideology of secularism could be. And if we, and perhaps one of the ways that we can have this conversation or work this out is through our public spaces and through our cities. I do think this is the time for a very, very deep self-reflection. I think it's a time that we have to acknowledge all our mistakes, our great failures. And it's only by doing that that perhaps we can clear the ground for a new conversation, for a fuller definition of secularism that is uniquely ours, rather than, and I think, maybe cities can come into this discussion. I think by this, this sort of incredibly heavy footprint, this imprimatur that changing the central vista. It doesn't matter who's changing the vista. It doesn't matter what, but the fact that that is what is being changed is where the conversation needs to start. Of course, to me, it makes a huge difference who is changing it and what they're saying, but just the fact that that is what is under siege at this moment is certainly an indication that we need to be rethinking our ideas of what the nation can be before it is taken away from us and becomes what we no longer are allowed to participate in.
Thank you, Arshia. This is really, really fantastic. Every bit as fantastic as we had thought it would be. I wanted to build upon what Vikram Aditya briefly touched upon in the first comment, which is this question of liminality. And it strikes me that we need to sort of reconstruct the liminal within our cities, because of course we cannot construct it in the forest anymore. And one of the things that the liminal does in the forest in the Ramayana and as has been said in also European constructs, in almost all constructs, is that it is a place where governmentality is absent. It is a place where control is absent, or it is a place where certain norms of codified behavior are missing. And because these norms of codified behavior are missing, one can transgress what was codified. What would be, maybe this is a broader question for others as well, but what would be those spaces in the city that are intersectional, that are feminine, that are secular, but defined through, our, almost through a kind of subaltern lens, that I don't think that the subaltern has to be not non-secular. And so I think that these are perhaps the building blocks of a potential central vista, or if we were to build it.
I do think that it's really hard to think of the liminal within the city, because the city is predicated on order and control and regulation. We must cross the road.
Not the bazaar. Not the Maidan. There are potentially places that one can violate. There are rules are looser, especially in Indian cities. I think one can say that.
Well, the first thing that came to mind when you were talking is, and they used to be much more visible, these spaces in cities, is, these old sort of trees and temples where women go and get possessed. Yeah, that is the freest space that I've ever experienced in a city. Of course, it's a feminine space. It's a profoundly feminine space. It is a space of, you're reaching beyond the mundane. It is a space of complete chaos. And it is a space of incredible, incredible freedom. And I find it interesting that those spaces are getting erased,
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's in Arundhati Roy's Ministry of
yeah, exactly.
So it's helped me. It's late here. Ministry of Utmost Happiness. She finds the dargah and the burial ground as this liminal space.
Yeah. And anywhere where we can have visitations from another world, right? Where we believe that the membrane between the sacred and the profane is, if not ripped apart, at least open or permeable. Where one realm can talk to another. Those are real. But I don't know. I cannot imagine that those would be architectural spaces, or those are spaces that we can create. It seems as if these spaces bubble up on their own. Well, I think one of the things that has I don't think ever really been fully unpacked in this business of Babri Masjid and Ram Mandir, and below Ram Mandir there is remains of a Buddhist temple. There has to be something like a sacred space. It's not simply about conquest. It's not simply about, I will crush your religion and put mine on top. There is some kind of acknowledgement that there is something happening here by this rock, by this tree, that has power, that has energy. I think of Ellora. There is Hindu temples, Buddhist temples, Jain temples. Okay, of course, it's on a trade route. Yeah. Everybody wanted to come. But why that place? The trade route is like miles. Hundreds and hundreds of miles. But no, the conglomeration of these multiple religious places has come around this one rock and this one hill. And I think that we need to listen to more, Neelkant was saying, how do we bring the forest into ourselves? Stop constructing, listen to what the land is saying. If there's a reason why people have been building religious spaces here for 1,500, 2,000 years, that we've forgotten, I think,
Arshia, again, thank you for your wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask you, we are in a time when stories and myths can be very easily fake news, and the line between what we listen to as stories is muddled with fact. And yet, in terms of an intellectual exercise, the space of myth seems to be a potential forest. So to say, the possibility of of sensing it as a forest that allows you to kind of ease out some of the things that get locked into disciplinary, orders of some sort. I was just curious to know what you think is the place of stories, myths in our time, but also in particularly the time that we are off the central vista and the Babri Masjid and the Ayodhya temple, because it's becoming difficult to know what is a story and what is its place.
But myth and epic and all like that, there's spaces of the imagination, profoundly spaces of the imagination. And very often when I teach younger people, especially in India, somebody is sure to raise their hand and say, but ma'am, is it true? And I'm like, well, it's not true in the same way that history is true. It is possible that long, long ago, there was a king who was sent into the forest because his stepmother wanted her son to be king. It's possible that when he was in the forest, his wife was abducted. It's possible that he made an alliance with forest people, and he fought a great battle to get his wife back, and he comes back and reclaims his kingdom. But that is not Ramayana. Ramayana is Hanuman, flying monkeys who speak Sanskrit. It is 10-headed demons. It is this, the way the imagination has elevated a completely mundane story into something that is profound. Yeah. So is the Ramayana true? No, it is not true in the way that history is true. Is it true in terms of literature? It is profoundly true. It is true in terms of what it says about us as human beings. It talks about how we might be jealous, how we might be sad, how we might lose the greatest love of our lives because, something else is saying, oh, you better be a good king, not a good husband, whatever it is. No? So it is, the Ramayana is existentially true. Yeah, and that is why it's still with us. So is the Mahabharata, so is the Iliad, and I think one of the great losses that we suffer as human beings when we literalize a myth or we historicize a myth, we lose the idea of sacred geography. Now Ayodhya is one place. Before that, Ayodhya was everywhere, all the time. Sthala Puranas, you travel through this country everywhere you go. Yeah, oh, राम जी सीता जी यहाँ वो रात गुजारे थे. अरे वो झरना जो है ना, वो सीता जी को प्यास लग रही थी तो लक्ष्मण ने अपना बाण चलाया और वहां से पानी निकला. अरे ये तो सीता जी की रसोई है. Sita is always in our backyard. So is Rama. They are our people. हमारे पड़ोसी हैं, हमारे यही इसी गांव में वो एक रात है. That is how the world becomes sacred. And to say कि नहीं एक ही जगह है, यहाँ राम जी का जन्म हुआ, कि वहाँ ये हुआ, वहाँ. I mean, in Karnataka, yeah, there are 3 places where Ravana lifted Sita and took her away. 3. I have visited all 3 of them. Imagine how many more places there are like this across the country. कि यहीं से उनका अपहरण हुआ, यहीं से यहाँ उनकी चांद की बाली गिरी. How beautiful is that? How fantastic that the divine is always by our side. Yeah, I mean, this is what we've lost, by literalizing our histories and limiting our geographies. Yeah, so.
क्या बात है आर्शिया जी.
सही है ना, इसलिए
एकदम सही है. अरे इससे सही कुछ और नहीं हो सकता है.
Really, I feel that loss so. I take it really personally, that I'm not allowed to say कि बस अभी मेरे बगीचे में, ये आम का पेड़, वो सीता ने आम खाया था और गुठली यहाँ छोड़ी और ये पेड़ वहाँ से आया. Why am I not allowed to say that?
Arshia, there are questions from some of the attendees. If I can just read them out, yes. And you can respond to them. One question is, can the urban space of today be regarded as the forests of the Ramayana, where one is afforded plenty of anonymity to discover oneself and experience other societies and people away from the cultures restrictive and conservative that one is raised in?
I have to believe, and I do not mean to be disrespectful in any way, but I think this is a question from a young man. I don't think any woman would ever say that. Yeah, that she can find herself in the city or find herself in a place of safety and confidence. So no, I don't think we can see the modern city in the way that you're describing it, no? Because I think you're seeing the city as a place of challenge, because that's where we meet many different kinds of people. We're exposed to new ways of thinking. I think the city has become not simply a place of action, but a place of reaction. Within a city, we are always called upon to, we're so overstimulated that we're reacting all the time. And that, I think, would make it fundamentally different from any kind of forest, yeah? A forest of the imagination, or a forest that is literal, or a forest that is ecological. The forest remains, I think, a place of reflection. That when you encounter difference or change or challenge in a forest, it also gives you the space and the time to reflect upon that and hopefully to change yourself, as Rama does, I believe. So the city, just by being a place of overstimulation, cannot be the forest.
But that does, one second, Riaz, if I may follow up. I mean, because that does raise the question of the possibility of thinking the heterotopic space within the city as the forest, right? I mean, if one is to redesign the central vista, perhaps the only possibility of rethinking it through this system would be to think of it as a forest. How do you create a vana in the city?
That would be brilliant if it just went to trees and, I mean, instead of like controlling it and nurturing it, just let it grow. At least 50, 70 years from now, 3 generations away, in the heart of the city will be a space of quiet and hopefully meditation, self-reflection. And meditation becomes a bit like heavy. People are like, I want to meditate or whatever. But nobody says, no, I don't want to reflect on myself. We're egotistic, narcissistic, Self-reflection is very exciting. Meditation where you don't think about the self and the ego is a little intimidating. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the forest connects deeply with water, which was an earlier presentation by Pankaj on the sort of how one would rethink so one has to sort of undo the idea of the city, and by inoculating in times of COVID with forests and waters in that sense.
Yeah, this
sorry, Riaz.
No, not at all. Vikram, please feel free to come in. Arshia, you answered the next question, which was asking you how you thought the central vista should be embodied. So I'll pass that and move to how does one navigate the hegemonies of geographies in the Valmiki Ramayan that is increasingly being treated as foremost, as opposed to the interpretations of geographies that exist in the Ramayanas written by writers from various other regions and in other languages?
I'm not sure I've understood the question entirely, but I think I addressed something about geography by saying how we've lost our sacred geographies. I'm not sure what the person means by the hegemonic geographies of Ramayana, because one of the things that is wonderfully, wonderfully clear and a great pleasure when you read many Ramayanas. Each Ramayana is located in its own space. If you read Kamba, you are reading about the flora and fauna of Tamil country. If you read Kritibasa in Bengali, the boss person in Kritibasa is Manusha. Yeah, nobody plays fast and loose with Manusha, right? You go outside the sort of political India, and you look at Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, where the Ramayana is prevalent. I mean, it's their geography. It's also their mythical universe. Once basically from Bengal eastwards, Hanuman is a very different person. He's not this brahmachari celibate and all. He's quite the ladies' man, and he has many children, some that he knows about and some that he doesn't. But the women that he sleeps with, the semi-divine beings that he sleeps with, are all highly, highly local to those geographies and to those sociologies. So I don't think there are hegemonic geographies in Valmiki. If there are hegemonic geographies, the hegemonic Ramayana is not Valmiki, it's Ramcharitmanas, it's Tulsidas. Because of where it sits in the Hindi belt, because of the sort of the hegemonies of the Hindi belt are what we should be talking about, not the hegemonies of the Ramayana. The Ramayana, one of the beautiful, beautiful things about the Ramayana is how gentle and how absorptive it is to other cultures that want to tell its story. I mean, it's told in a Muslim country, it's told in Indonesia. There are in Laos and Cambodia, Rama is a bodhisattva. Yeah, Lakshmana is his equally Buddhist brother. No, I don't think, I would argue that it's not a text of hegemonic geographies, certainly. Yeah.
If I could pick on that a bit, William Golding said people believe a myth is something that is not true, whereas it is actually a kind of truth that can only be told in a story.
Absolutely. My teacher, Wendy Doniger, she has this great line. She says it's not hers, but I've never heard it from anybody else. She says, a myth is a lie that tells the truth. And I think that is just this perfect little formulation of how we are to receive these stories, you know. Like I said about Ramayana, they are existentially true. They are not literally true, you know. And I'm so, people want Ramayana to be literal. It's like, no, for me, I want it to be this imaginative space. It makes me believe that we have the capacity to think beyond what we see. You know, who's seen a flying monkey? Not me. I don't think Valmiki saw one either, right? But the fact that we can think about this, that is truly, truly human, you know? Yeah.
So I just wanted to suggest a proposition for the studio to take up, that picking on A.K. Ramanujan, who says that the truth in the myth is not in some authentic original, but the extent to which you are personally transformed by it. And perhaps we should start thinking in our design exercise, look at how the city can be constructed so it enables that transformation.
A myth becomes true only when you can own it, when you can see yourself in the myth. Yeah, when you can say, I know what that feels like. Yeah, so Ramayana has become mine. And by all sort of proper hegemonic, institutions and procedures, I should be the person furthest from the Ramayana, but it is completely mine because I believe it speaks to me. And more important, I speak back to it, you know?
There's a wonderful passage in Lyotard on the circular structure of myth. Have you read that?
No, I have not, but I would be very grateful if you sent me. Yeah.
He says it's in the postscript of the postmodern condition, and he says that when I listen to my grandmother tell a myth, I know she received the authority to tell by listening earlier. In my listening now, I receive the authority to tell later. And the myth contains the subjects of ethics and culture and ecology, which both teller and listener occupy. So there is no privileged position of knowledge and expertise. There's just a continuous recycling of it.
Yeah. I'm very glad. I mean, but you know that as you can see, it's a modernist position, right? I mean, like even like 500 years ago, people like, well, you might have, but I certainly would not have had access to Ramayana in any way, shape, or form. Gender, religion, personal predilections, none of that. I am the Malecha. So.
So maybe then you're the right person to ask, Arshia. The next question is, how would you define, or how do you see the dharma of Delhi today?
Dharma of Delhi?
Yes.
Oh I'm grateful for many, many, many things in my life. And pretty close to the top of that list is that I don't live in Delhi. So I don't think I don't think I'm qualified to speak on the dharma of Delhi. It's actually a city that frightens me incredibly much. I do everything I can to not go there. So sorry, I'm not the person for that. Yeah.
If there are any of the panelists who would like to ask questions before we conclude, please do so now. Or before we've already had Arshia on for about an hour and a half.
I have one, if I may. Wanted to ask you, in your role as a translator, do you see the position of languages as creating spaces and ideas differently? In the sense that when you translated Sanskrit to English, did certain positions open up more easily than it did in Sanskrit?
What do you mean positions?
In the sense, this ability to kind of relate women's bodies to cities, for example, did that happen perhaps more easily once it was translated? Did you see that happening more easily in English?
Yes, yes, because English is my first language, profoundly my first language. And I think that when you move something from, when a thing becomes familiar, when you move something from an alien place into something that is your own, the first important thing is you would never have thought of it in your own language, right? That is why it has come to you from somewhere else, right? But you're not sure what its contours are. You're not quite sure what its implications are. You're not quite sure where it begins and ends until it becomes yours, which is through your own language. I mean, this is not true of simply ideas of translation, but it could be true of anything, that something we are able to see something differently when we are set at a distance from it, right? But at the same time, that distance has to be bridged, that distance has to be negotiated. I also think it's, I mean, one of the things that happens with translation is that your vocabulary becomes enriched, yeah? Because I have to search for words to translate Sanskrit that I normally would not use in English, and every now and then I'll get fixated on a word and I'll say, oh, I must use that word more often, even when I speak, right? And I believe that over these years, my spoken language has become inflected, perhaps even with archaisms, because I actually find that that's what I mean to say. It really means what I want to say rather than, something else that I would have to cobble together with many words. And, in terms of cities and languages, you take, a great city like Bombay, for example, or, to a lesser extent, Bangalore. But the brilliance of Bombay is that the argot, the street language is Gujarati, Marathi, Hindi, Farsi. It's got a bunch of things just polyglotted around it. And that's a very, very romantic idea. But what is happening now is that most of us who live in cities, we speak many languages, but we speak them all badly. Yeah? We don't read in our languages. We are not literate in terms of reading literature, right? So what we are losing in our cities quite rapidly is the imagination, because if we don't read in local languages, nobody will write in local languages, and if people stop writing in local languages, our vocabularies will be impoverished, right? It directly impinges on what words we have to express ourselves, So I mean, I'm not a nativist, and I say, oh, everybody should learn an Indian language. You learn what you learn, it's how you. It's very often dictated by the terms of your life. But I am very, 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 very sad that we're going to start losing literatures. So.
Thank you.
Arshia, thank you so much for this conversation, and for just opening things up for us in a way that has been fantastic. It has connected to many of the themes of the earlier talks in different ways. The earlier ones may have been literal, very important in the ecological content, but what you've done for us today is opened up the possibility of enjoyment and kind of ownership of stories and kind of engaging in this space, which can get sometimes terribly disconcerting, with an optimism and a kind of joy that it's very generous of you to share with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much, and thank you to Neelkanth, who thought that I was worthy of being here. So actually, the thanks should go to him. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No, thanks to you. And certainly, I couldn't have invited a worthier speaker. Thank you very much.
Now, Bas, I am really getting embarrassed, and I'm going to say thank you.
आप नर्वस थे इसलिए मैं ये सब कह रहा हूँ. नहीं, बहुत अच्छा था, बहुत ही अच्छा था.
I hope to see you all again, if not in the real world, at least like this. So,
Please do feel free to join the other conversations.
I will.
And it would be wonderful to have you conversing with us on those as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.